Let's now look at one of the key characteristics that defines the states and societies and living conditions throughout the entire region, and that is the rentier nature of these economies. We will try to explain what a rent is and what the characteristics of a rentier economy is, and I think it's very important that you understand this correctly, because it's perhaps the most important factor that determines political and social outcomes in the region. Let's look first at the functions of a state in an abstract manner. If you look what state formation entails, it's basically the state's ability to accumulate power. And what do we mean by this? It coincides with the growth in productive power and the growth in the government's ability to coerce. Thinking back to what we said about Weber's analysis of order, you need power, Macht, as he calls it, the physical wherewithal to compel obedience. That's the first necessity for governance, and that is, in a sense, the process of state formation, is the ability to amass the physical power to compel obedience. And this then coincides also with the growth in political and institutional power, the institutions that can do things for you. So it's linked to bureaucratization and the centralization of states. And this is in a very abstract manner. And if you look at the way states have formed, it also coincides, the creation of stable, effective states coincides with the neutralization of rivals. Again, think back to what we said about Weber's definition of a state. He says the state is that organization that successfully claims the monopoly of legitimate violence. So in most states, in most societies, you have alternative sources of violence. What distinguishes them is that violence emanating from a criminal gang, for example, is considered to be illegitimate and is normally prosecuted by the state. So the state is the only source of legitimate violence. And that is, if you just briefly think of the states that exist today, that's not necessarily an accurate description of what we see. If you go to a place like Somalia, if you go to a place like Afghanistan, if you go to many places in the inner cities of the developing world, there's a lot of violence, and often a lot of the violence is considered to be legitimate because there's no state that could claim that monopoly. So state formation also coincides with the creation of durable institutions of surveillance and control. That's in a very abstract manner. That's something that applies to all states. So what we're now looking at is the process after independence, after states in the developing world, particularly here now in the Muslim world, have achieved independence and now try to consolidate these states that they have inherited. And remember that much of these states are nominal in character. They exist, they have a name, they have borders drawn up by others, they have a flag, they have some form of government structure, often a king that is being placed by colonial powers. But this nominal structure now needs to be filled with actual capacity, with actual power to compel obedience. And that is the process we see now. And I'd now like to draw your attention to the one social scientist, Charles Tilly, who wrote about the formation of states in the European context. And I think some of the lessons he draws from there are applicable universally. They're not necessarily linked to the European context where he observes them first. And he draws up a very interesting connection between the ability to fight wars and the formation and consolidation of states. So he says, and he observes, this is his observation of the historical record, that in Europe, following the example of France, you had military and political power requiring ever larger control over larger areas of territory, which had to be centrally administrated. And once one country does this, the others have to follow through or risk annihilation. And so he catchily phrased up, he says, war makes states and then states make war. So the ability to, or the necessity to fight wars, whether for defensive or for aggressive purposes, requires to lay control over relatively large areas of territory and centrally administer them. And so the ability to defend yourself or to wage aggressive wars leads to the expansion of state capacity. And that has three important implications. It's political, administrative, and fiscal. So what do we mean with these three aspects? Politically, it becomes necessary for these states now for the absolute monarchs that we have at this point in the historical evolution of the European state. It becomes important then to extend rights of representation and some form of participation in the decision-making to those powers that allow them to tax, that can contribute to the war effort. And this is in the European context, these are feudal lords who are now getting certain rights, and they get them laid down in contractual agreements, and certain co-participation rights in the decision-making. And the reason this is done is not out of a normative conviction, but it's in order to facilitate the flow of resources that these people can then collect locally and then make available to the central state. So the take-home lesson is that relative legitimacy increases your ability to collect resources, and that makes you a more effective military force. And that therefore leads to greater success. So greater legitimacy leads to greater ability to collect resources, leads to greater military capacity, and therefore leads to your ability to wage more and more successful wars. That's Charles Tilly's main argument. Administratively, the implications are similar. You need, in order to collect resources, you need larger and technologically more sophisticated armies, and these armies in turn require central bureaucracies that both that allow them to organize these armies correctly. It's perhaps the best example of this is the invention of the general staff by Prussia in the 18th century, and the creation of special institutions that train special general staff officers whose task is precisely to organize the logistics of an army. They don't actually command units in battle. That's not what they're trained for. What they are trained for is to run the bureaucracy of an army. And that the general staff, as it was created by Prussia in the 18th century, becomes universally emulated by virtually all armies everywhere else. And today, if you go to any army in the world, there is a general staff, and they have specially trained general staff officers on this model. So you need administrations to manage your army, and that has implications on your administrative capacity overall. Thirdly, you have a fiscal implications of this state consolidation. Once you have better central bureaucracies that collect resources, it becomes a virtuous cycle. The enhanced capacities to prosecute successful wars, which, as I said, in turn requires bureaucracies to run the army and bureaucracies to collect resources. That in turn enhances your capacity to collect even more resources and to structure your economy more efficiently. So it becomes a self-reinforcing cycle in a sense. So you have these political implications, administrative implications, and fiscal implications of state consolidation. So Tilly's main argument is a rather simple one. He says that the ability of getting ready for war and actually waging war requires actions that are frequently conducive to state making, the consolidation of state capacities. And it plays out in two important aspects. One is the the effective extraction of resources, both for the purposes of war making, both in manpower terms and in financial terms, requires an efficient bureaucracy. So you have to create bureaucracies in order to do this war function that the state needs to do. And secondly, closely related, is in order to get ready for war, you have to promote capital accumulation, either by economic activities directly by the state or by the state fostering economic activity in order to get the resources which then make war possible. And that also requires a centralized, efficient bureaucracy. So both of these aspects ultimately lead to your creation of administrative bureaucratic capacity. And as we mentioned in the beginning, this is what Weber's whole idea is of the modern state, the rational bureaucracy at its heart, which is not just an organizational thing, but also creates habits and attitudes of mind that are important to operate these aspects, something that we mentioned in the last week when we described the military performance of, for example, the Egyptian army in some of its wars against Israel, that it had the weaponry, but not the mindset and the training necessary to operate a modern army. And that's exactly here, this is exactly what this refers to, the bureaucracies, both within the army and in the civilian sector supporting the army. It's them who create these mindsets, the habits of operating modern institutions, modern tools of statecraft. And it's here where we see the problem with Rentier economies, to which I come in a minute. So before we come to the impact of rents, let's think for a second about what makes a strong state. How do we distinguish between weak and strong states? There are any number of ways to define the strength of a given polity. But one thing, and I'd leave it at that I'd like you to draw your attention to is how do you define a strong state? What do you think? What distinguishes a strong state from a weak state? And you might probably be now thinking in terms of police states, repression, authoritarian states. So, and it's a very common misperception to mistake authoritarianism and repression for strength. And while we see particularly in the Arab world, many states that are authoritarian and that use strongly repressive ways of social organization, we should not be fooled by mistaking these aspects for strength in terms of state capability. And it's I leave this for you to ponder, but I just draw your attention. I'd like you to think about whether an authoritarian state can necessarily be defined as being strong, and whether it's not more useful to look at the ability of states to actually carry out decisions. And here, particularly in the Arab world, particularly in the authoritarian states, we see that there are very strong limitations on the state's ability to actually influence political outcomes. And that's, in my view, a more useful marker of how to place a state on the spectrum between weak and strong states. And here we actually see that many of these states, despite looking very bellicose, looking very repressive internally, are actually quite weak because they cannot steer and control political outcomes very successfully. And in a comparative analysis of war preparation strategies in Israel and Egypt, Michael Barnett, in his book Confronting the Costs of War, he tries to do exactly this. He tries to evaluate state power empirically and looking at data. And he suggested that the level of tax revenues accrued to by the state is a good substitute marker to allow us to draw conclusions about the relative strengths of states. So, and this is not just because it gives revenues to the state, but as I just said, in order to collect revenues, you need the bureaucracies, you need the mindsets, you need the trained personnel to do this. And all these things you also need to do all sorts of other things that states need to do, not least of which is war fighting. So the ability to actually collect taxes allows us to draw inferences about the consolidation of a state. So resources are important, but it's perhaps even more important is the institutions you need to collect resources. And that leads us to the question of rents. What is a rent? You all probably pay rent for your housing where you live. And that's in return for the services made available to you. And the person who makes that housing available to you has incurred costs. So building the building, maintaining it, etc. So in economic terms, the rents are slightly more technical than just what you pay at the end of the month. It's those portions of income received for goods and services in excess of the opportunity costs of their provision. You wonder now what that means. It's the opportunity cost of the provision is the regular value that a goods or service has in terms of the productive factors that go into it. So labor, capital, land, know-how. So it's what the provider of that goods or service, the cost that he has incurred to have it available. And now when he can charge a rent, that is sort of the margin, the extra profit he gets from a temporary scarcity in the goods or service. And in competitive markets, if there is a temporary scarcity of a goods or service, you will have other producers springing in, providing that goods or service, and that the price would get down, and ultimately that rent, that extra excessive margin that the provider can charge would diminish to a market price where supply and demand are in sync. But now sometimes due to geographical or geological particularities, market dominance, or deliberately caused scarcities, and that's where the cartels come in, monopolistic rents can be charged over longer periods of time. So it's not just a temporary scarcity that can be exploited, but the scarcity is made permanent. And it's important now to remember that the rent that you can charge for something that is scarce, that can be something that is physical, like oil in the ground, but it can also be your geographical location. So you can make your land available for a military basis, or you can make your land available for an oil pipeline to go through it. It can also be simply the provision of political support for which you can charge rent, because if you're a highly popular country, and then you can charge people for supporting them. So this is the rent, and the important thing is that there's no productive input really necessary in order to charge that excessive profit. Now, what is it, a rentier economy? We're dealing here with economies where the actors can obtain wealth not through productive activities, as we normally have, but by exploiting structural scarcities. So, as I said, the accident of having certain minerals or goods in your ground that others would like to have, or that your territory is valuable to others, or that your political support is valuable to others. And for that, you can charge people, and you don't have to actually come up with any productive labor in order to charge these rents. And when we look at whole economies, Hasan Biblawi, is one social scientist, has suggested a 4-step test when we can speak of a rentier economy as opposed to a normal economy. And it says if the rent situation, i.e. the ability to charge profits for unproductive goods and services that you don't have to produce, predominates the economy. So we see this aspect always, but when it predominates the economy, that's the first test. The second test would be that the economy relies on external rents to a substantial extent, so that there's not a strong domestic productive sector, but the overwhelming resources that the state and society have at their disposal comes from the outside. The third test is that only a very small proportion of the working population is actually involved in the production of that goods or service for which the rent is charged. So either because it's not necessary at all to engage a labor force in it, or when the labor force comes from the outside. And fourth, and perhaps most importantly, that the revenues accruing from the rent go to the state and not to individual private actors in the economy. So we have these four steps. Rents predominate, rents come from the outside, very few people are involved in the production of the goods or service, and the rent revenues go to the state. And now, remember that rents can be charged for a physical commodity like oil here, and we see early oil exploration in Saudi Arabia, but they can also be charged for a strategic location, such as land for a military bases, etc., or for a pipeline, or for political support, as we saw very aggressively during the Cold War, where some countries used their support to extract rents. And note also one additional paradox. Most of you will now wonder and says, what is he talking about? He's talking about rentier economies. Yes, we know Saudi Arabia has oil, Qatar has oil, but Egypt has very little, if any, oil. Syria has no oil to speak of. What about Turkey? What about Somalia? There are many countries in the region that have very little or any oil, and the oil wealth is not equally distributed. So all that I've been saying now might be relevant for those countries that dispose of oil, but what about the others? Clearly, they would have to function like normal economies and collect resources domestically. And this is the counterintuitive observation that we make, is that because oil states worry about the stability in their region, in order to ensure stability and tranquility, they use their rent to buy allegiance. So in effect, they share the oil wealth throughout the region. So in this connection, we see the countries here in the region, even if they do not dispose of oil wealth themselves, they have access to some portion of the oil rents accruing to the countries that have oil, which then pay it to these countries in order to buy allegiance. And so, in effect, we see both oil states and non-oil states behaving and being characterized by rentier economies. Now, you might also be wondering, why is he talking about this one relatively obscure, or for you seemingly obscure, aspect of the economic structure that much? And this is because the effects of a rentier economy are very, very pronounced. The point we already mentioned is in the normal context, I say, in countries that do not have something for which they can charge a rent, in the state formation processes that I just outlined with along Charles Tilley's thesis, you have an evolutionary process of state formation where states become ever stronger in the process of achieving greater functions, not least of which is warfighting. And what we see here is now that the economic and political evolutionary processes that have to take place, and that normally do take place, are now short-circuited and stalled due to the availability of rents. So the availability of essentially free resources to the state stopped the state from becoming more consolidated. That's the first and very important effect of rents and in rentier economies. The second is that externally derived rents break the otherwise natural linkage between state and people. So, because the state is not dependent on taxing people, he is not interested and he has no economic incentive in promoting economic activities in his population, but also there's no incentive for him to involve them somehow in the decision-making process. So the main effect is that states are now relieved of the burden of taxation, and therefore they don't have to build the extensive bureaucracies that are usually needed to extract resources and accumulate capital. And therefore the primary function of a state, that is normally the collection of resources, here becomes a distribution or allocation of rents rather than extraction of resources. That's the first and very important effect of rents on a state and society. The second, almost equally important, is that oil wealth or any other rent can now be distributed and allocated in order to placate potential opposition. So the government can effectively buy off opposition through the payment of welfare, basically, welfare transfers. And note here that this is a possible outcome, but it's not a necessary outcome. Governments, if they mishandle that spending, can actually create opposition, something that we saw in Saudi Arabia, because some parts of the country, particularly the Shia minority, were deliberately excluded from these transfer payments. And that then creates an opposition that otherwise would not exist. So, but in general, now states have the ability to buy off opposition. And that's something we see very, very active in a very dominant fashion throughout the region. Something that we have referred to earlier on as the Arab social contract, the rentier contract that ensures the relative stability of these societies. Another aspect is now that because income is essentially free and people do not have to be coerced in order to extract resources from them, the state becomes often the extension of the family that happens to be in power. We have this very much in evidence in the ruling families in the Gulf, many of which had been in power even before oil wealth became available. But we have essentially the same approach in some of the other societies, where we have parliamentary systems, but then they morph into basically family fiefdoms, something we saw in Tunisia. We saw it very dramatically right now in Syria, where the state becomes basically a family property. And they can only do that because income is essentially free. So to use a somewhat overused phrase from the American political revolution, which you remember the Boston Tea Party was based on this slogan, no taxation without representation, where the settlers in the colonies demanded political representation in return for the taxes that the British king levied on them. We now here have the reverse situation, where there's no representation without taxation. So because people don't have to be taxed, there's a strong tendency to exclude them from political decision-making. And here the external link is important, because we now have ruling families, particularly in the Gulf, ruling families that are propped up by external powers that have an interest in extracting that the oil, and they enter into an alliance with between the external power that has an interest and the ruling family that has an interest in it. So it's a mutually advantageous, almost symbiotic relationship here, in which the populations are excluded. They are not part of that arrangement, and they're placated through welfare payments. So we see throughout the Gulf, and not only through the Gulf, that states now use the distributive functions of that they can assume because of this essentially free income, to bolster the legitimacy, to not only buy off active opposition, but actually create the ability to provide for their clients, their population, in the class, in an extension of the classical patrimonial arrangement. They see this as a source of legitimacy. And that is something we see very, very markedly in the Gulf, but also in the other countries, albeit then at a slightly lesser level of transfers. And this phenomenon we see dramatically in the decade from 1970 to 79. It's, if you remember, it's the period also in which many of the Gulf principalities had just become independent, and where the oil price starts now to dramatically increase. And particularly after the oil price hike of 73, it explodes. We see, for example, in Saudi Arabia, income from oil during this period increases 25-fold. See similar phenomena throughout the region. When we talk about Iran, we see it's the same phenomenon. So you have now societies and states that were very poor and very, very, and I don't mean this pejoratively, backward in the sense of non-modern and in pre-modern social arrangements, and states that are extremely shallow, very weak institutionalized structure, they now have this enormous wealth at their disposal. And it's basically wealth that accrues to the personal family of the rulers, who can dispose of it in an essentially absolutist manner. And what they now do is the previously small and poor governments dramatically expand. So they start to build very large bureaucracies to create, I mean, it's a form of employment, but essentially it's a form of transferring revenue to parts of the population and buying off political support. You see the state expenditure and services grow exponentially. We see a dramatic expansion in health services, for example, here in a Saudi hospital. And the state's reach that before was extremely limited now reaches to virtually all citizens in the country. And the state becomes a very, very prominent provider of goods and services and often cash payments to the population. And so we see here the explicit implementation of what we call the Arab social contract, the Rentier contract. It's patronage in return for complacency, for political neutrality of the population. And the form it takes are heavily subsidized public services, public utilities, state employment, free education, free healthcare. So the population is now guaranteed the comforts of middle-class life on an international level in a society that until very recently, literally in the living memories of the individual people, had been extremely poor and living in very, very harsh living conditions in the desert. And where the daily life had been a struggle for survival, they now enter a period of extreme leisure and comfort. And you can imagine that this is going to cause certain problems in political terms, in institutional terms, in economic terms, and not least in psychological terms. And to these problems we will turn to now in the next video.